For a long time now, Brother Baker has been trying to get me to tell my experience. He said he listened to a tape several months ago where I'd preached quite a number of years ago on it, and he said, I'd love for you to do that again sometime. I haven't had a mind to, but tonight I think I'll at least start out in that direction and see how it is. Hoping that it would be a benefit to all of us, and some of the newer people like Brother and Sister Setters have never heard it, except maybe, as I've mentioned, little pieces of it in other sermons. I've heard a lot of old Baptist preachers preach over the years and heard them tell some of their experience and fit the Bible in with it, and it has always blessed me to hear them do it. I can remember, I guess, I don't know where to start, but I'll start here and lead up to how we found the Old Baptist Church. I can remember back in March of 1954 of getting discharged from the Army, having spent 4 years in the Army, and just almost immediately after getting out of the Army, I went to work at the Beckett Paper Company in Hamilton. I remember in that days when I got out of the service, you went to the unemployment office, work was so good that they asked you, where do you want to work? And just about anywhere you wanted to work, they'd hire you. And that's how times have changed. And I remember telling them that, well, I'd like to work at the Beckett Paper Company. All my life it had been one of the good places to work. So they sent me over there and they hired me right on the spot. And but almost immediately I started going to church. My wife's folks were members of a Missionary Baptist church in Hamilton. And the first night that I went was on a Wednesday night. It was the last night of a week's revival meeting. And I remember the man preaching that revival meeting that I heard the last night of was G.B. Vick from Detroit, Michigan. And at that time, I think the Temple Baptist Church of Detroit, Michigan, that he pastored, was the second largest church in America. It may have even been the largest. If it wasn't the largest, it was the second largest. And I remember that night he preached on hell. Of course, it was an Arminian message that if sinners didn't want to go to hell, they'd better get saved. And I remember that I was under great conviction, and I didn't know what all that meant then. They told us that dead alien sinners get under conviction and that they could sit in a church service while they were singing an invitation song and almost pull the back off of the pew resisting the drawing of the Holy Spirit to get saved. Well, I've since learned that anybody that's under what they call conviction is an evidence of life. You're already saved. It's not you're in a place to where you're under conviction and ought to get saved, but anybody that's under conviction, that's evidence of life. The Lord has already done something in their heart, and that's the reason that they feel convicted of their sins. But I successfully that night resisted coming forward in the church house and getting saved. But from that Wednesday night all the way to Sunday, it seems as though I was just scared to death that I could be involved in an automobile accident or something like that and be instantly killed and go out into eternity, into a devil's hell. And I remember as I would drive back and forth from work, I would pray a prayer. God help me to get back into church Sunday night, and I'm going to get saved. The reason I said Sunday night was I was working 7 days a week, day shift, and the next time I could get back would be Sunday night. Not realizing that I had to be in church to get saved. But, that's almost the mentality that is left with people is that you got to get in church to get saved, and not only that, but you got to come forward to this. I don't know where to call this, the front or the back end of the church. I guess the front, in order to get saved. And I thought that I'd been taught that. Well, that Sunday night rolled around, and my wife and her folks were there, and the pastor of the church was preaching this time, because on the Wednesday night previous to this, it had been the closing night of revival meeting with G.B. Vick preaching. And I remember that night that the preacher talked a lot about Jesus Christ and His dying on the cross. And I can remember all through that message that I knew that I was a sinner. And I knew how weak I was, and he said enough about Jesus Christ that I was saying all through that service that if what Jesus Christ accomplished on the cross, if that didn't avail for me, there probably wouldn't be any hope for me. And I really did look to the cross that night to land me someday in heaven in immortal glory. But as they come to sing the invitation song, as they called it that night, for people to come forward and get saved and join the church or rededicate their lives, they had invitations for almost everything. And I remember that night how that I had prayed, Lord, let me get back in the church house tonight, and I'm going to get saved, and how that I still resisted. I'm a child of God. I know that now. I didn't know it then. I thought it was lost and going to hell. But now that I look back on it, I was a child of God, but I didn't know it. And that there was still the temptation to hold on to the things of the world and not completely give yourself over into under the Lord, into His service. And although I had prayed and I had promised the Lord, let me get back in the church house, I'm going to get saved. But there I thought to myself, what's all these people going to think of you? Walking that aisle, your pride and stuff like that. And I probably would have successfully resisted that night, except my wife stepped out first and went forward, and I followed right behind her. And went forward and took the preacher's hand, and he asked me, do you accept Jesus Christ as your own personal Savior and all of this and that and the other? And I said, yes, I do. And so they voted to receive us, to be baptized the following Sunday. And I remember that night when we went back home to my mother-in-law's house, I had a pack of Chesterfield stuck in my shirt pocket. And I remember when we got into their house that I wanted to smoke so bad. But now I was under deep convictions against it, because I'd been taught that way. Now the fact that I supposedly had got saved just a few hours ago didn't take the desire to smoke away. It was still there. Well, I finally pulled out a Chesterfield and lit it up and smoked it. Now, according to some people out here in the world, I lost everything I got 2 hours before that when I smoked that cigarette. Isn't that something to say that your home in heaven or hell depends upon smoking a cigarette or not? But that's just exactly what a lot of folks believe. And then they got the gall to stand up and say you're saved by the grace of God. Well, where's the grace in that? There isn't any grace in that. That's all your own effort. We don't need Jesus Christ under a system like that. Jesus Christ profits that person nothing. And but the next day, on Monday, I went to work. And I knew that I had a job on my hands telling those that I worked with, but I worked basically with one man. That's what had happened to me. I mean, there was that reluctance to even tell them. But I knew the quicker I told them, the better off I'd be, and I did. We went out to lunch together, me and the man I worked with that day, to get something to eat, and as we was walking back from getting something to eat, I pulled out a full pack of Chesterfields, and I said, Charlie, I said, you want these? I'm not going to smoke anymore. And as we was eating that day, and as we were walking back, the thing went in my mind that I cannot be a good witness of Jesus Christ smoking these cigarettes, because there's so many people out there in the world that look upon it as wrong, and therefore it's going to impair my witness to them if I do that. Now, I'm thinking as I thought then, you see. And so I vowed that I was never going to smoke another cigarette, and I gave them to him. It was one of the hardest things I ever had to do. It was very difficult, but from that day to this, a cigarette has never touched these lips. And almost immediately, following Sunday, I was baptized, and 2 or 3 others, down at the Lachlan Baptist Church down on Mill Street in Lachlan, because this church didn't have a baptistry, and so they borrowed their baptistry down there at what's now the Landmark Baptist Temple, but in those days it was the Lachlan Baptist Church down on Mill Street in Lachlan. And almost immediately I felt a keen burden to preach. And being in the church that I was in, they supported a seminary in Springfield, Missouri, and I began to make plans to sell my house and move to Springfield, Missouri. Now I know better than that type of thing, but I want to tell you this, that I was living up to every bit of life that I had. I was full of a lot of zeal and so on and so forth, and there's nothing wrong with that. But our zeal certainly ought to be according to knowledge. So the next summer, along in the month of June, I believe it was, we had sold our house. And at that time, I had 3 children. My son Steve was still in diapers. Judy had not yet been born, but I had 3 children. And I had an old 49 Pontiac that I didn't think would ever make it to Missouri. And we loaded up 3 rooms of furniture on a trailer that we hitched to the back of the car and took off for Missouri, and I think I had $100. Didn't know a soul out there. First thing we did when we got out there, I said, there's no way I'm going to be able to drive all the way around this town, look for an apartment with this big, huge trailer on that, so we unhitched it. And I said, well, I better write down the intersection of this, where I'm parking this thing here. I'll never be, we get off in another part of town, we'll wonder, where did we leave the trailer? So I got out and I wrote down the intersection of such and such a street, and went looking for, got a paper. And looked in the paper, and there was this little 4-room shack that was for rent for $40 a month. I had $100. Well, we went down, a man that owned a furniture store had it for rent, and we paid the rent, and my wife's father had come on out there ahead of us to meet us there to help me unload all that furniture into the house, and so we finally got a hold of him, and he and I spent that evening unloading the furniture there. Then the next day I tried to find the college where I was going to be going to, and this and that and the other. And also to look for a job, because the time you bought a week's groceries, why, although at that time you could buy a week's groceries for $12 or $13, the rest of that $60 that I had after paying a month's rent would soon be gone. And I started the school, of course, and I can truthfully say that during those 2 years that I was there, and I went to 3 years of school in 2 years, as I went to 3 summer schools, and I literally studied the Bible day and night, and gradually as time went along, I began to see truths that was out of harmony with what I was being taught. I remember one time coming to see that wine ought to be used in the Lord's Supper. I made a thorough study of baptism and the Lord's Supper and the doctrine of the church, and I began to see myself in disagreement with this Baptist Bible Fellowship, like the Grace Baptist Church in Middletown is one of those churches, for example. The Landmark Baptist Temple is another. I remember going to Noel Smith. He was one of my professors, and a man that I thought a great deal of. I went unto his office one day and I said, "Brother Smith, I want to talk to you. I'm troubled about something." I said, "In my study of the Bible, I've come to see that wine ought to be used in the Lord's Supper and not grape juice. Yet all of the churches in this fellowship use grape juice." I said, "What's your opinion about that matter?" Oh, he says, "Brother Garrett," he says, "there isn't any question but that wine ought to be used in the Lord's Supper. But if you were to try to push that in this fellowship, you'd be in trouble." So that they just wouldn't have it. But he said there isn't any question that the early church used wine in the Lord's Supper. Well, I left out of his office that day feeling very troubled. I thought, there's something wrong. Here is a man that I thought a great deal of, but yet, even though he admitted that a certain thing was true of the Bible, because of the trouble it would cause him among his brethren, he would go against God's Word. And that bothered me and troubled me a great deal. Roy Thompson, who some of you know, was a very close friend of mine at that time. He and I spent a lot of time together. We worked on a job together. And we would visit and we would talk Scripture a great deal. And I remember in studying the Bible, one day I had come to see the doctrine of a limited atonement. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I saw that the Bible taught that Christ did not die for the entire human race, but that He died for His elect people only, and that every one that He died for would live someday in heaven in immortal glory without the loss of one. Now, when I saw that, most people, they see total depravity first. Some of the other points of grace they see first, and usually the toughest and the last point of all for them to see is the limited atonement. That's the most difficult. I saw the most difficult one first. And I said to myself, if Jesus Christ died for the elect only, then election must be true. And if election is true, total depravity must be true. So my last straw was, I went to the dean of the college, Reg Woodworth, who also taught some theology and some doctrine along with Noel Smith. And I knew that Reg Woodworth had a little belief in the doctrines of grace because he had tried to preach it some, tried to teach it some, especially total depravity. He would bear down on that, and I had heard rumors that the other professors didn't like him because he bore down too strong on total depravity. So I went to his office and I said, Brother Woodworth, I said, I'm leaving the college. I said, I've come to see these doctrines of grace, and I've had nothing but difficulty out of the student body, and I said, I just cannot walk with the people that don't believe these doctrines of grace. Now, I like just 9 weeks of graduating. And I remember what he said to me. He says, Brother Garrett, he says, don't leave school now. You've only got 9 weeks to go, and then you'll get that sheepskin to hang on the wall. And he said, I agree with you on these doctrines. He says, but I'll tell you what we'll do. Between you, there are listening and questions that you can ask me, we can teach these things, but we just won't call it by its name. We won't call it total depravity. We won't call it a limited atonement. But we, without using those names that are offensive to people, will teach the doctrine. Well, that didn't sound good to me either. I said, no. I said, I don't like the sound of that. I said, let's call it by its name what it really is. Well, he said, we can't do that. He said, we'd be in trouble. So finally I said, no. I said, I'm leaving. And he made one more attempt to try to get me to stay, trying to play on my pride or something, that sheepskin ought to be very important to me, to be able to get that diploma. And I said to myself at that time, and I think I even said to him, I said, what's important to me is the understanding I have right up here in my head rather than something that I can hang on a wall. Now, I hope that I don't sound at any time tonight like I'm boasting or bragging or anything like that. That's not my intent, and God knows if I am. And if I am, God will take care of me and will cause me to suffer as a result of it. But when the old Baptists got me in that council meeting quite a number of years ago, they didn't know some of the experiences that I'd already had of people trying to tell me what to preach and trying to use some of these tactics. I'd have never got into the old Baptist church if I'd have been a kind of man that they tried to get me to be at Oak Ridge. I'd have never made it into the old Baptist. Well, anyway, I left Springfield, Missouri. In the meantime, several months before that, I had a new student had come. He come in midterm. His name was Jerry Loker. He was from Springfield, Ohio up here, and he had won a Mr. Ohio contest in weightlifting. Oh, he was a beautiful specimen of a man, good-looking man, about my age, maybe a year younger. We struck up a very close friendship, and he would come over to my house, and I'd go over to his house. He was a good singer, and his wife too. They would sing duets in the church frequently out there. And it wasn't long until I convinced him of these doctrines of grace. Boy, he took to it just like that. And when I got ready to leave, he said, I'm leaving too. And I remember him and his wife, we loaded up both houses of, I think we hired a truck, that's the way it was. And hired a man to even drive it. And he was going to live with us. We didn't know what we was going to do, so we rented a big house in Hamilton. He took the upstairs apartment, we took the downstairs apartment. Until we kind of got our lives straightened out, we both got a job driving an Omar bakery bread truck. And barely eking out a living. And it wasn't very long after that till he and we had become acquainted with the Baptist Examiner of Ashland, Kentucky, with John R. Gilpin and Bob Ross as the editors of it. And we had been reading that for a little while and saw that they stood for just exactly what we did. So we made a trip to Ashland, Kentucky right after we'd come back and met Elder Gilpin and Bob Ross, and they received us with open arms. And I felt like I have found the people that I had been looking for that took a strong stand on things and believed in the doctrines of grace. And I began writing for the Baptist Examiner, and I was reordained and rebaptized and all of that, and we started a church in Hamilton. And at this time, Brother Loker felt like he wanted to go back to Springfield and maybe start a church there, so they left and went to Springfield. But we got a few people together and got a church organized. We started out, we met in our home. We used, after Brother Loker left, we moved upstairs and used the downstairs as a church. We hadn't started very long, only, we hadn't even got constituted yet, but we'd been meeting. And one Sunday afternoon, I'm laying on the sofa in the living room, and a knock came at the door, and it was Brother Harris. I didn't know who he was. I'd never seen him in my life. He says, are you Elder Garrett? I said, yes, I am. He said, I'm Wilbur Harris from Middletown, and says, I'd like to talk to you about the church that you're trying to get organized. I said, come in. I didn't know it when he come in, but he left his wife sitting out in the car in Nancy. And we sit there and talk for about 15 or 20 minutes, and the more he asked me what I believed and all this and that and the other, and his eyes just lit up. I mean, he really had found something that he had been looking for. He said, the wife's out in the car. He says, what time do you start services? I told him. 7 o'clock, I believe, or 6:30. I can't remember now. But he said, and it was about an hour and a half or so before church time. He said, my wife's sitting out in the car. I said, well, why didn't you say something? Why didn't you have her come on in? He said, well, I didn't know I was going to even catch you home or how long I might be in here. But he said, we're going to go get something to eat and we'll be back for church. So he did. They come back. We had a good meeting. There was another family that come from Middletown that wanted to join with us. And so just shortly after that, we constituted a church with somewhere around 10 members, 10 adult members. And things went along fine for a while. And we bought a church building not long after that. And it wasn't long after that until about this time was when Brother Bradley went over to the Primitive Baptist. And his belief before he went over was the same as mine was. And some of the people did not want to go over to the Primitive Baptist. So we got a couple of those families. I remember Brother and Sister Sebastian. Some of you remember them from the Cincinnati church. Wonderful people. Came up to our church. And Junior Gibson and his wife. Two wonderful people who joined with us. And then there was 2 or 3 others that came, but they never did join for some reason or other, but these did. And things was looking wonderful for us. And then finally, we had a little problem, and I resigned the pastorship of the church and moved to Middletown. At this time, Brother Robinson, well, just before I moved to Middletown, Brother Robinson had been involved in a little church here in Middletown, and he had some differences with them, and he drove up to Hamilton one Sunday afternoon, and he and I talked, and he says, Brother Garrett, says, I'm not in agreement with where I'm going. He says, let's try to get a church. I understand you're not pastoring a church here anymore. He says, let's try to get a church constituted in Middletown. I said, that's fine. So I moved up to Middletown, and we rented a little building over on Lefferson Road, Brother Robinson and me, and started holding services. One Sunday, Brother Boggs came, saw an ad that we had in the paper. We didn't see him anymore for about a year later. But anyway, we finally got a church constituted, called it the Sovereign Grace Baptist Church, and the church that I'd pastored in Hamilton was the New Testament Baptist Church, and when I left that, the church continued on with Joe Gadd as the pastor, and eventually most of the members were from Cincinnati, and eventually they sold that building and got them a building down closer to Cincinnati, and as far as I know, the church is still in existence over in Norwood. But anyway, eventually we bought a house over on Arlington Avenue, and we couldn't afford the building that we was renting over there, so we thought, well, if I could live in the same place where we had church, we would do better financially. So we bought that building and used the one huge large room downstairs to hold services in. But along about this time, through more study of the Bible, I come to see the place of the gospel. That the gospel didn't have, and incidentally, just before this, I'd come to see the errors of Sunday school and things of that nature, and so the guilt in people dropped me. He said, well, they wouldn't have anything to do with me. I'd done away with Sunday schools and a lot of other of these man-made things, and so they wouldn't have anything to do with me. And for a year or so, there we were, the little church at Hamilton, all alone in the world, not knowing of anybody in the world that we could fellowship with. Brother Tolley told me one time when we was right in the middle of this trouble and I wouldn't do what they wanted me to do, he said, Brother Garrett's either crazy or he just likes to stand by himself. Well, I've never liked to stand by myself, but I have stood by myself sometimes because it looked like that was the only way to go. Not because I liked it or anything like that. I've always liked fellowship. And anybody who knows me, I've always encouraged it. I've always encouraged, brother, let's go to these meetings and support these meetings and so forth. I've always done that when we were, in fact, some people didn't like it because I was always encouraging them to go and support these meetings in the area and so forth. And I never told anybody to go somewhere that I didn't go myself. Eventually, I saw the place of the gospel, and it like scared me to death. I was sitting in my living room studying there on Arlington Avenue when I come to see these things. I mean, you say you come to see it all of a sudden, but it's a long period of study that finally opens up to you and you see it. Not that you went to the Bible one time and studied something and you saw it, but it's years of study, and finally it opens up to you. Well, that like scared me to death because I knew, although I had never met any primitive Baptists, I knew what they believed. And it like scared me to death because I had studied myself right into being a primitive Baptist, and I'd always heard nothing but bad stories about them. That they were a funny people behind the times that wouldn't walk across the street to care about anybody. I'd always heard all kinds of stories about them, and it frightened me to death. Well, once I saw these things for several months, I taught them to our church, but I didn't tell them what I was teaching them was primitive Baptist doctrine. Then one Sunday afternoon, church up here at Tapscott, I'd been by it a number of times, and I saw that they met on the second Sunday, but they met all day on the second Sunday. So I decided that I wouldn't tell the church anything about it, but just as soon as I let out services at noon, I was going to get up there and be in their afternoon service just to see what it was like. So I did. I went up there, and they were just breaking out. I remember that day I preached a short sermon so I could get up there as early as I could. And when I got up there, they were just letting out their morning service, and the women were just getting ready. At that time, it was like maybe February or early March, and they were spreading out the dinner on the inside. They had some big long boards that they put across the pews and put the food out. And they had a couple of tables in the back for people to sit down to eat. And Ralph Cooley was the pastor of the church at that time, and from over at Hagerstown, Indiana. And somebody recognized me when I walked into the church house as being a missionary Baptist preacher. There were only about 8 people there. And I remember how wonderful those people treated me at that time. I never was treated any better in my life. The sisters just come up with a big plate of food and said, sit down here, and they all were very cordial to me. They didn't try to argue and fuss with me and all of that, and that impressed me to a great degree. Here I am, not knowing what I'm going to find. And that afternoon, evidently Ralph Cooley had preached in the morning, and they had a man who was just exercising to preach in the afternoon. Well, I remember Ralph Cooley, when he led singing, they had a rocking chair sitting right here, and he sat down in the rocking chair and started leading a song. He didn't even call out the page number. They used the daily book, and he didn't even call out a page number or anything, and everybody just followed him. They found the song and everything else, and I thought, boy, that's something. He didn't even call out the page number, and everybody knew exactly what song he was singing. Whereas the group I was with, they had to post the number on a board up here. And I remember the first song that I ever heard was Preservation, where it says, cast down, but not destroyed. That was the most beautiful song that I ever heard in my life, even though there was only 8 old people there. Well, the man who preached wasn't so old, and Ralph Cooley was probably 55 or so at the time. And I remember how much I enjoyed that singing. Most beautiful singing to my notion. It probably really wasn't, but it felt that way to me, and after all, that's what counts. And when the man got up to preach, to tell you the truth, I didn't get much out of his preaching, but I did get something out of the humility that the man showed when he got into the stand. I hadn't been used to seeing that. He made apologies for his littleness and that unless the Lord come and blessed him to preach, he wouldn't be able to preach, and that attitude meant a great deal to me. I was just ready for that. But the actual preaching, I have to say I didn't get that much out of that. But I remember when the service was over and all the people came around in the parting hands, I saw the old sisters embrace him, and a couple of them kissed Brother Cooley on the cheek, and Brother Baker, who was the one that was the younger man that had done the preaching, although he was older than I was. I just thought that just melted me down. I'd never seen anything like that in my life. And I drove away from that church that day feeling very good. I'd already studied myself into the doctrine, most of it. But the way I was treated that day just kept it all off. And I saw their beautiful humility and their love and their simple manner of worship. And I said to myself, I'm going to ask for a home with the Old Baptists just as soon as I can. In the meantime, I had talked some to Brother Warren and Brother Bradley and Brother Willis. And I remember on this particular Sunday night, I asked the people. We kind of had a little conference meeting like. Brother Boggs, you was there then. And Brother, I just had a debate here with the Church of Christ when they owned this building, with Howard C. from Nashville, Tennessee, and I remember there was 8 Old Baptist preachers who came. Brother Bradley, his brother-in-law, Elder Thomas, Brother John Friend from Connersville, Brother Kenneth Morris, old Kenneth Morris from Connersville, Brother Rice Bolender, Brother Noah Shipman. I don't know how many I named there, but I think there was 8 altogether. And I remember when that 4th night of that debate was over, and as I walked out the back door, Brother Bradley put his arm around me, and he knew that I was getting close to come to the Old Baptist, and he says, Brother Garrett, he says, I guess you know now who your friends are. The people that I had anything to do with at that time wouldn't support the debate, but the Old Baptist did. I didn't say anything outwardly to him, but I said in my heart, no truer words was ever spoken. I certainly see who my friends are. So that next Sunday night, and Brother Harris, I've mentioned this to you all recently, that I got him to come to that debate. We had fallen out years before that, and I hadn't seen him in quite a number of years, but I got a hold of him and invited him to the debate. I knew he liked debates, and so he came. He didn't know anything about my now having these Old Baptist leanings. But he found out in that debate just exactly what I believe now, and he liked it. And he started coming to church again. Brother Ayler was coming, and some others that we had gotten over the years. And that night, on that Sunday night, I told the people, I asked them, I said, Brethren, have you enjoyed what I've been preaching out to you here the last 6 months or a year? I remember Brother Robertson stood up and said, Brother Garrett, I never have enjoyed anything any better. He didn't know what I was getting at. I was getting them out on that limb, about ready to saw them off. But I wanted to get them committed first. I mean, sometimes you got to use tactics like that. The reason you do that is to keep them honest. I knew how long it had been since I'd been preaching this Old Baptist doctrine. And so I said, Brethren, have you been enjoying what's been preached this last 6 months or a year. Brother Robinson said, I never have enjoyed anything better in my life. And I think maybe another one or two said the same thing. Nobody had any negative thing to say. So then finally I lowered the boom. I said, well, brethren, I want to tell you, what I've been preaching to you all the last 6 months to a year is not only is it Bible doctrine, but it's primitive Baptist doctrine. And I restated a sermon that I'd preached on the 3 phases of justification. And I've been getting in about the place of the gospel and all of that. And brother, you could hear a pin drop. It got so quiet. And I said to them all, I said, I'm going to the primitive Baptists with or without you. I think they have the identity of the church. We don't. That night, I think I went on and preached a sermon on the historicity of the Baptists and showed how the division took place in 1832 and showed where the true church was in this particular day. I said, it's with the old Baptists. I said, when the service was over, I asked them, what did you all want to do? Brother Robinson again spoke up. I always loved Brother Robinson. He's a close friend to me all these years. And he said, Brother Garrett says, why don't we invite an old Baptist preacher to come and preach to us once and just see? I said, that's fine. I said, I'll get a hold of Brother Bradley and see if he won't come up. So I went down and visited with Brother Bradley. He had been in the old Baptist by this time for about 8 years. You know, a lot of time had elapsed here. And he said, yes, he would. We said the next Sunday night. Well, there we were. We had seats for about 35 people in the room that we held services. We lived in the other part of the house. And about a half hour before service time, I heard a knock at the door, and I went to the door, and there's a family standing there. I don't know who they are. They said, is this Elder Garrett? I said, yes. Said, well, we're such and such a folks from the such and such Primitive Baptist Church. We understand that Brother Bradley's going to be preaching here tonight. We want to come up. So I said, fine, come in. Wasn't long, another knock at the door, another man and his wife, and so forth. And come in. It kept going that way, one right after the other. Carloads pulling up in the front of the house. Well, I come to find out later that Brother Bradley, they had dismissed services that night at Cincinnati Church so that whoever wanted to come would come up, and several families. You know, the old Baptists, when they find out about a little bunch that's seeking the way to Zion, I mean, the word gets out, brother. And old Elder Willis was there, and so on and so forth, and why, first thing you know, all of those 35 chairs were filled, and I had to take some in our living room, which was in the room right through one doorway, and the sofas all was filled up in all the chairs, and they just kept coming. Put some in the kitchen and sitting them in around the dining room table in the kitchen, and then I had them going up the stair steps, going upstairs.
Please turn the tape over to the other side. Turn it over to the other side.
Well, right away, I thought to myself, I'd been taught that old Baptists wouldn't walk across the street. You know, just because they didn't believe in saving souls for heaven and immortal glory, it's told that they didn't care about anybody. Well, I thought, now this don't coincide with that. Here they've heard about a little people that's seeking the truth, and why they're coming from everywhere. Well, Brother Harris has still got a copy of the tape that Brother Bradley preached that night, and was it ever a wonderful message? He didn't do anything but tell his experience, just like I'm telling tonight, as to how he come to find the old Baptist. Why, he said, I even went to England trying to find the truth. He said, I'd heard about the strict Baptists of England, that they held the truth, and he said, I went to England. And he said, I listened to the strict Baptists preach, and he said, boy, they did a good job preached out the doctrines of election and all that, but till they got right down to the end, and then they ruined it by saying, won't you give your heart to Jesus? And took it all back. And he said, I left there disillusioned. He said, I went everywhere looking for the truth. And then one day he said, I was down in Charleston, West Virginia. Somebody had invited me to attend the Old Liberty Association of Primitive Baptists, all them mountain folks. And he said, I went in, and, they knew who he was and all that, and the one moderator of the association, after several of those sing-songy preachers had preached down there and so forth, he felt like that, well, maybe this highfalutin preacher didn't like that kind of preaching, and maybe I ought to make some apologies for them. And sometimes we get to thinking that, as Old Baptists, we get new people coming in, and they've come from this church and all that, and we got to start apologizing for our preachers and things of that nature. And this preacher started to do that. He said, now, some of our preachers don't have a lot of education, and maybe you overlook their mannerisms and this and that and the other, and all that. And Brother Bradley said, I just thought, he said, preacher, if you knew how much those preachers had blessed my heart today, you wouldn't have to make any apologies for them. And he left that building that day, decided that he was going to go and ask for a home among the Old Baptists, and finally out in Madisonville, Kentucky, not too long after that, he asked for a home down there where Elder J.D. Shane was pastor. And he told all of his experience that way. And I'd look around the room, and I saw old Elder Willis sitting there, big man, with tears just streaming down his face, and him wiping those tears away as Brother Bradley was telling his experience. And Elder Bowden, they're sitting over there washing a pew away with the tears streaming down his face. And he would shout right along with Brother Bradley. Boy, that mouth was just giving it that. I mean, he said every word the preacher said. And he was only about, 8 seconds behind him, He had to say it, but he repeated it every bit. Oh, listen, some of you folks that never met these people, you really missed it. I don't want to say that to make you feel bad, because there are other folks who come along. One of these days we'll be telling folks who come to this place after Brother Boggs is dead and gone, we'll be saying to them, you should have met him. And maybe one of these days after I'm dead and gone, somebody might say, wish you could have met Brother Garrett, and might have some kind of story to tell. Anyway, when I observed that night, boy, I'm going to tell you, never in my life, I said to myself, have I ever seen a people that could rejoice over somebody telling their experience about Jesus Christ and the truth like that. I'd never seen the tears that I saw that night. And did that ever bless my heart? Well, when the service was over, several of them lingered around a few minutes to talk, and finally everybody had gone. And I told our people, before they all left, I said to them all, I said, brethren, I said, I have seen the truth. And I said, I know where the identity of the church is. And I said, I want a home with the Old Baptists if they'll have me. And I said, I have high hopes that our whole church will want to go over to the Old Baptists. And I remember telling Brother Bradley and Elder Willis, I said, you all will be hearing something from us before long. And I said, I want all of our church people to stay after everybody else is gone. So after they left, I said to them all, I said, brethren, I'm going to the Old Baptist with or without you. And I said, I would hope that you all could see and love this like I do. And I said, come next Sunday. You've got all week to pray about this matter, to think about this matter. But I said, I'm going, if they'll have me, and come prepared to vote next Sunday. Well, the following Sunday come, and we put it to a vote, and every person in the church voted to go ask for a home for the Old Baptist. Well, I called Brother Warren, went and talked to Brother Warren and Brother Willis about it. And at that time, the Hamilton Church was having a fellowship problem. For some years, they had been out of fellowship with the mainstream of Old Baptists. They were making some headway of getting back into fellowship with them. But I remember Brother Warren gave me this very wonderful advice. He said, Brother Garrett, he said, the Hamilton Church would love to take you all into our church and constitute you into another church from the Hamilton Church. But our church is kind of factionalized at the moment, and Cincinnati Church is not. And if you joined at Cincinnati Church, you would not be on the outs with any primitive Baptists. It's just like us today. If we were to constitute somebody into a church, they automatically would be on the outs with a lot of folks, you see, because they don't recognize us. So we did. We decided to do it that way, and Brother Bradley wanted to make it a good meeting. He wanted to get Elder Doherty, who was very experienced in this type of thing, to be able to come and moderate the thing. This was in December. Brother Doherty could not get his schedule free until February, so there we had to sit from January and the first half of February waiting. We continued to meet, but waiting to join the Old Baptists. But finally it came, and they started the meeting on a Thursday night. They had all-day meeting on Friday and all-day Saturday, and then we were to join on Sunday morning and be constituted, baptized Sunday afternoon and constituted on Sunday night. Well, that building was packed. I mean, they'd got the word out, Brother Bradley had through his radio broadcast, that there was a little church wanting to make their way over to the Primitive Baptists, and this is great news for Old Baptists to hear. And said, we're going to hold a 3-day meeting in Cincinnati starting on such and such a date. And brother, I'm going to tell you, there were 300 Old Baptists that come from other parts of the country. And I met some of the most lovable people that I've ever seen in my life. A lot came from Nashville. I remember that. All over they came from. Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia. I remember the first service that we was in down there, they put Larry Wolf up to lead the singing from Lexington. And I'd never heard anybody lead singing like he did. And the singing was so beautiful. And the words of those songs, I'm going to tell you, I just could not believe that anything in this world could be as wonderful as that. Heard some wonderful preaching throughout with various preachers preaching. Well, it finally comes Sunday morning. We all offered ourselves to Cincinnati Church and were received. And Sunday afternoon, they had borrowed a baptistry at that time. Cincinnati didn't have a baptistry, and they borrowed a Missionary Baptist Church. I remember their baptistry, not too far away there in Hartwell. And all of these Old Baptists went over there, about 300 of them, and watched us baptize. Brother Doherty and Brother Bradley both did the baptizing. There was about 10 or 11 of us, 11 I think. Brother Bradley would baptize one, Brother Doherty the next. I remember Brother Bradley baptized me, Brother Doherty baptized my wife. And that was when Brother Boggs, that day after we was all baptized, that they lined us all up in front of the church, and all of those Old Baptists come around. And Brother Willis embraced you and says, Brother Boggs, says, I don't want to discourage you or anything like that, but he said, as happy as you are, he said, your troubles have just begun. And I remember there was an old sister who come through the line that saw how happy I was. Or no, it's Brother Troutner. Brother Troutner come through the line and saw how happy I was, and he embraced me, and he said to me, he said, Brother Garrett, he said, just think, this is just a little taste of what heaven is going to be like. Only it'll be 1,000 times better, and stay that way all the time. Now, just think of the happiest you've ever been in a meeting. I mean, to where The tears were flowing, you were shouting, you were just lifted up into heavenly places. Just think of that, if you can remember it, and think of it being 1,000 times greater than that, and it just stay that way all the time. Now that gives you just a little bit of what heaven is going to be like. That there won't be any breaking up of meetings like we're going to in a little while and have to go home. And have to go to work tomorrow and face the world and all that. There's going to come a day when meetings won't break up. Well, and these old Baptists were so lovable, I had never seen a people in my life like them. And the preaching that I heard, the humility of the preachers and all that was just too much for me. Well, that night, as we had planned, we rented the auditorium of the Sherman Schoolhouse over in Middletown to constitute ourselves into a church. And they had a lot of preachers. I don't remember how many preachers, but there must have been a dozen. It was Elder Doherty was the moderator, and they elected Brother Paul Troutner, I think, as the clerk, and Brother Warren and somebody else to read the Articles of Faith, and Brother Doherty and Brother Bradley both, I think, delivered the charge to our church. Elder A. Olshire was there, and several of the Blanchester brethren were there. There was just lots of preachers that was there. There was even 2 or 3 from Indiana that refused to take part. So they never did have anything to do with Brother Bradley. But that was their loss. We were reconstituted that night as an old Baptist church. I had laid my credentials down, previous ordinations and all of that. And about 2 months later, the church called for my ordination. And also we ordained Brother Mink, I believe. No, let's see, did we? No. Yeah, it was when you was. It was just Brother Robinson, I guess, was ordained as a deacon, and I was ordained. No, it was Brother Harris. That's the way it was. Brother Harris and Brother Robinson was ordained as deacons, and I was ordained to the ministry. It wasn't long after that. Well, in the first 6 months, we baptized 9 people. Sister Abner, Brother and Sister Ayler, and I'd had all kinds of trouble getting Brother Ayler in. Brother Ayler didn't want to be rebaptized. He said, Uncle John Gilpin baptized me a number of years ago, and sure ain't nothing wrong with Uncle John's baptized. But eventually, he saw it and came later, him and his wife. And Brother and Sister Noble, and Brother Baker, within that first 6 months. And then it wasn't long until trouble hit, and we lost 5 or 6. And over these years, it's just gotten better for me. It was in 1967, when we were constituted in February, and it was December of 66 when we decided to go over, but we had to wait on Elder Doherty's schedule. And how many years is that? That's 22 years that we've been in the Old Baptist Church. It was 32 years after I left the seminary in Missouri. It's been that long. And it has just been one wonderful experience after the other. My finding the Old Baptist was in steps, as I just told you. I left the Missionary Baptist, went with the Gilpin people, and then eventually over into the Primitive Baptist. But I think what it shows, I didn't have any help. I wasn't like the Ethiopian eunuch that had Philip to get up in his chariot and sit down beside of him and tell him the truth. Now, that would be wonderful to get it that way. I mean, I'm not... ever how you come to know the truth is going to be wonderful. But I'm an example of somebody who can find the Old Baptist Church by just studying the Word of God. And others have done the same thing. And it has been such a joy over these years. It gets better, and we sing that song, and Brother Greg, maybe we can sing that in just a little bit better farther on. It has gotten better for me over the years. Don't let anybody ever... It was wonderful when I first joined. I didn't think it could ever get better. It's like the sister that told Elder Troutner when he first joined, and he joined with Brother Bradley and them. A sister from down in Virginia told him, she says, "Preacher, it gets better further on." And Brother Troutner told me later, he said, "I wouldn't have argued with that sister for nothing in the world, but he said, I knew that as happy as I was, there ain't no way that it'll ever get better than this." Shows sometimes that we don't know. He was sincere, but he says, over these years I've proved her right so many times. That sister knew what she was talking about. I hadn't experienced it yet. But it does get better further on. And it makes us, we can't understand when we get some folks who leave it. Like many that have left it. The last one being Sister Edna. You can't understand it. Oh, I can sit down and say this happened and this happened and I saw this happening and all that, but after you've said it, it's still a great mystery to you. As the people who could rejoice in all of this, I mean, somebody could ask Brother Baker. We have asked him. You know what his answer is? I don't know. He don't even know the answer to it. Well, if he doesn't know the answer to it, how in the world are we going to know the answer to it? And the heartaches have been many. But the love that I have felt over the years among the old Baptists, even with many of those that I have had wars and fallings out with, I still love them with all of my heart and soul. Brother John Robbins, as much damage and as much harm as he's done to me, I love the man. I think he's a wonderful preacher. Always like to hear him preach. And brother, I'm going to tell you, we could get back into fellowship as far as I'm concerned with just a snap of your finger. And I wouldn't make him have to get down and squirm and ask for forgiveness. You got to get down on your knees, Brother John, and you got to start apologizing, and you got to beg with all the harm you've done to me. And listen, a person don't have to do that to get back into my fellowship. They don't have to do that. But some folks demand that. But not me. Just lay aside all the things that has caused the trouble and say, we're going to lay it aside, and that's all you got to do. And, but this is a little heaven on earth. There's just nothing in the world like it, and it gets sweeter every day. This is the church, beloved, and I am not ashamed to tell anybody that this is it. Now it's little and it's insignificant. The Jews rejected Jesus Christ because of that very thing right there. But I believe with all of my heart and soul that this is so wonderful and this is so precious that it's worth fighting for. It's worth suffering for. But we can lose everything we've got if we don't tend the house properly as the Lord has told us to do it. Little by little we can let it slip away. Let's turn in our songbooks and sing a song in closing, and we'll take the parting hand as we sing. Number 276.
What is that steals upon my brain? Is it death